Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. Today's episode comes to you courtesy of my amazing patrons. Once a month, patrons vote on what commander that they'd like to see in an upcoming episode. The commander that gets the most votes wins. And the commander that got the most votes this month was Dina Soul Steeper. Dina is a 1/3 Dryad Druid that costs black-green. She has, whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life, and by paying 1, you can sacrifice another creature, and Dina Soul Steeper gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X the sacrificed creature's power. So Dina is a fantastic commander, allowing you to drain your opponents every single time you gain life. Now, she doesn't care how much life you're gaining. It can be 1 life all the way up to 20 life, but every single time that happens, you drain your opponents. So instead of focusing on gaining a ton of life, Dina is more so going to benefit you for more instances of life gain. On top of that, of course, you can utilize her as a sacrifice outlet. Again, just by paying 1, you can sacrifice any other creature. So yes, that is not a free sacrifice outlet, but it's still a fantastic one and can be utilized in a lot of circumstances with some of the cards I'm going to be bringing up here. Regardless, yeah, there are a lot of fantastic cards that work very well with Dina, even on a budget, and on this episode, I'm only going to be bringing up cards that are less than $1. That's right, every single card in this deck, including the commander, is less than $1. So with all that said, let's jump into it. So first up, let's talk about some repeatable sources of life gain with things like Fountain Renewal, Ill-Gotten Inheritance, and Dogged Pursuit. Fountain Renewal is an artifact for just 1 that says, beginning of your upkeep, you gain 1 life, and by paying 3, you can sack it to draw a card. So again, for just 1 mana, we've got a repeatable source of life gain that we can eventually use to draw a card if we really need to, but again, just on our upkeep, we essentially gain a life and drain each opponent for 1 with our commander in play. And speaking of punishing our opponents, Ill-Gotten Inheritance says at the beginning of your upkeep, Ill-Gotten Inheritance deals 1 damage each opponent and you gain 1 life. So in combination with our commander again, this is basically, hey, every upkeep you gain 1 life and each opponent loses 2 life. Okay, 1's damage and 1 is, life loss, but you know what I mean. In a similar way, Dogged Pursuit says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So very similar to Ill-Gotten Inheritance, but at our end step, and yeah, again, having multiple repeated sources of life gain and life loss for our opponents can be huge in this deck. And speaking of life loss, of course, we can utilize some cards like Falkenrath Noble and Vindictive Vampire, and yeah, they can help us drain our opponents out even quicker. Falkenrath Noble says, whenever it or other creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this does count any creature on the board, and again, keep in mind, our commander has a sacrifice outlet just stapled onto her, so that can really help us out. And then Vindictive Vampire says, when another creature you control dies, Vindictive Vampire deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. So again, each of these work in different ways. Falkenrath Noble counts any creature, Vindictive Vampire counts just our creatures, but still, again, when we drain our opponents, we are gaining life while doing so, and then our commander sees that, and we drain them further. But we can also utilize cards like Sangromancer and Dross Harvester to gain even more life, and again, while doing so, draining our opponents. Sangromancer says, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you may gain 3 life. Whenever an opponent discards a card, you may gain 3 life. So whether our opponent's creatures are dying or they're discarding cards, we gain life, and again, our commander says we also drain our opponents. And then Dross Harvester says, at the end of your turn, you lose 4 life. So that's not, all that bad of a thing, really. Again, not that big of a downside in a deck where we're going to be gaining a ton of life, number 1, and number 2, it more than makes up for that with, whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, you gain 2 life. So unlike Sangromancer, again, this counts every single creature on the board, not just our own. Regardless, each of these can be extremely effective at gaining us a ton of life, and again, in the process, draining our opponents with our commander. Next up, we can also utilize cards like Blightmound, Blossoming Bogbeast, and Sun Droplet. Blightmound says, attacking pests you control get +1/+0 and have menace. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. This can be used in fantastic combination with our commander, again, if we want to sacrifice one of our non-token creatures. And again, we have got like a Falkenrath Noble type of card in play. We drain opponents, and then we also get a pest to replace it that when we sacrifice, drains opponents. Okay, technically, again, the pest doesn't actually do the draining, it just gains us a life, and again, our commander drains opponents. You know what I mean. Regardless, Bosswing Bogbeast can help us out in a different way. It has, when it attacks you, gain 2 life, then creatures you control gain trample, get +X/+X until end of turn, X the amount of life you gain this turn. So first up, again, just by attacking, we gain life and again can drain opponents, and on top of that, we can utilize all of our life gain to make our army huge and swing through for a lot of damage. And speaking of damage, Sun Droplet says, whenever you're dealt damage, put that many charge counters on Sun Droplet. At the beginning of each upkeep, you may remove a charge counter from Sun Droplet. If you do, you gain 1 life. So the more damage that we take, the more counters we get on this, and again, if we've got enough counters on it, essentially on every single player's upkeep, not just our own, we gain life. And again, by doing that, our commander sees that every single time and is going to drain our opponents. So every trip around the table, just with enough counters on this, we gain, 4 life, and also drain our opponents for 4. So yeah, that can add up a lot throughout the game. And speaking of adding up, let's talk about cards like Druid Class, Retreat to Kazandu, and Retreat to Hagra. Druid Class says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and at level 2, we can also play an additional land on each of our turns. So first up, obviously by just getting this in play, whenever we play our land for the turn, or whenever we land ramp, well, we're going to be gaining life, and with our commander, draining our opponents. And just by getting this to the 2nd level, we then essentially ramp with this card as well by letting us play an extra land on each of our turns, which then drains our opponents even further. Next up, Retreat to Kazandu says, landfall, whenever a land enters battlefield on your control, choose 1, put a +1 counter on target creature, or you gain 2 life. And you can probably guess which one we're going to be choosing most of the time with this deck. Speaking of which, Retreat to Hagra works somewhat similarly in this deck. It says, whenever a land enters battlefield under control, choose 1. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until end of turn, or each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So now, simply by getting a land into play, again, we drain each opponent with this, and again, since we gained a life, we drain our opponents again. But of course, we're not quite done with gaining life with our lands just yet. I mean, let's talk about Jadi Offshoot, a 0/3 defender that has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield on your control, you gain 1 life. So this can be a great low-to-the-ground blocker that also, well, just gains us a lot of life throughout the game. In a similar way, there's Kazandu Nectar Pot, a 1/3 insect for 1 and a green that has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield on your control, you gain 1 life. But of course, a massive card for this deck can be Zuran Orb, an artifact for 0 that says, sacrifice a land, you gain 2 life. Again, since we're in green, we've got plenty of ways to get a lot of lands in play, and this can be an incredible finisher for us, allowing us to sacrifice a land for free to gain 2 life. So if our opponents are low enough, we can essentially just keep sacrificing land after land after land to get trigger after trigger after trigger on our commander to drain our opponents out. And speaking of draining our opponents out, let's talk about cards like Witherbloom Apprentice, Tablet of the Guilds, and Golem's Heart. Witherbloom Apprentice is a 2/2 human druid with Magecraft. It says, whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So now, on top of, those cards that we have that drain our opponents whenever creatures die or whenever we have lands, now when we cast spells, we just get to drain our opponents too. Speaking of which, Tablet of the Guilds is an artifact that says, when it enters the battlefield, choose 2 colors. So again, green and black. Whenever you cast a spell, if it's at least one of the chosen colors, you gain 1 life for each of the chosen colors it is. So even more ways to gain life, and again, ways to drain our opponents when we do. Speaking of which, there's Golem's Heart, which says, whenever a player casts an artifact spell, you may gain 1 life. So this counts when any player casts an artifact spell, not just us. So if you're playing against opponents that are running artifacts, like Mana Rocks or an artifact, style deck, you're going to be having a great time draining your opponents out, and your opponents, well, are not probably going to have such a great time getting drained out whenever they cast those spells. Moving on though, let's talk about some more somewhat conditional ways to gain life and drain opponents with things like Scavenging Ooze, Revenge of Ravens, and Trespasser's Curse. Scavenging Ooze has pay green, exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a +1 counter on Scavenging Ooze and you gain 1 life. So this can be some fantastic graveyard hate on top of just a card that can get massive in pretty much no time, and on top of that, again, when we do exile those creature cards, we are gaining life, which again in combination with our commander, drains opponents. And then Revenge of Ravens says, whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, that creature's controller loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So our opponents are really going to have to think about swinging at us with any creatures, because when they do, for every single creature they swing at us with, they lose 1 life, we gain 1 life, and then we drain all of our opponents thanks to our commander. And then then Trespasser's Curse is an aura curse that says enchant player, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under enchanted player's control, that player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this can be incredibly effective, especially against certain builds like, token builds, which they're going to be getting a lot of creatures out, draining themselves and the rest of your opponents for a ton. But out of all the cards in this deck, there is one, in my opinion, that stands above the rest, and that is the Golden Pig of this deck, which is the #1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is a very simple one with Marauding Blight Priest. It's a 3/2 Vampire Cleric that costs 2 and a black, and it says, whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. If that text sounds similar, well, that's the exact same text that is on our commander. So this kind of acts like a second copy of our commander, doubling up on our commander's trigger, and yeah, with this and our commander in play, now every single time we gain life, our opponents are going to be drained even further. This can add up really quickly, and yeah, just basically having an extra copy of our commander in our deck can be incredibly effective, and that's why Marauding Blight Priest is the Golden Pig. But not too far behind our Golden Pig is Epicure of Blood, a 4/4 vampire that costs 4 and a black, and it has, well, the exact same text. Whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. Now, obviously, the main difference between this and Marauding Blight Priest and our commander is that its mana cost is, quite a bit more at 5 mana, but it is still an incredibly effective card in this deck. And speaking of effective cards in this deck, of course, I've got to bring up Grey Merchant of Asphodel, Defiant Bloodlord, and Trudge Garden. The Grey Merchant, better otherwise known as Gary, is a 2/4 zombie that has, when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black, you gain life equal to life lost this way. So this on its own, okay, not technically on its own, we've got to have things in play, can drain our opponents for a ton. And while doing so, also gain us a ton of life. Yeah, it's a fantastic finisher in a lot of scenarios. Speaking of which, in combination with Defiant Bloodlord, this can be incredibly deadly. Defiant Bloodlord is a 4/5 flying vampire that says whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. So whereas our commander actually drains all of our opponents, this is more of a target approach that takes advantage of more life gained. And speaking of taking advantage of life gain, let's talk about Trudge Garden. It says whenever you gain life, you may pay 2. If you do, create a 4/4 green fungus beast creature token with trample. Again, we're going to have a ton of instances of life gain in this deck, and getting this in play and taking advantage of those life gain instances can just make us a giant army of 4/4 trampling creatures. So that can definitely be another avenue to victory. Moving on, though, we even can see some life gain with our ramp package with things like Pristine Talisman and Paradise Plume. Pristine Talisman has tap add colors, you gain 1 life, and Paradise Plume says when it enters the battlefield, choose a color. Whenever a player casts a spell of the chosen color, you may gain 1 life, tap add 1 mana of the chosen color. So depending on the situation and depending on what decks we're playing against, if we are playing against, let's say a Storm deck that is, 1 or 2 colors, we might pick one of their colors because they're going to be casting a lot of spells. Or we can just pick one of our colors depending on, what's in our hand. Regardless, outside of these life gain ramp cards, of course, we've got plenty of other ways to ramp in this deck with things like Explore, Fond of Fertility, Talisman Resilience, Rampant Growth, Search for Tomorrow, Growth in the Ashes, Cultivate, Edge of Autumn, and Sakura Tribe-Elder. Whew, that was a mouthful. Anyways. Next up, even with our draw, we even have some ways to gain life or take out opponents with things like Vampiric Rites and Damnable Pact. Vampiric Rites is an achievement that has pay 1 and a black, sacrifice a creature, you gain 1 life and draw a card. So again, like our commander, this can be an effective sacrifice outlet that actually can benefit us by drawing a card and helping us gain life to drain our opponents further. And then Damnable Pact says, target player draws X cards and loses X life. Again, targeting ourselves with this isn't really that big of a deal because we're going to be gaining a ton of life with this, so paying some life for some cards is pretty much always going to be the right choice. Unless an opponent is really low on life, and we can just utilize this to force them to draw cards and more importantly lose life to take them out. But of course, we also have some more standard draw spells in this deck with things like Blood Pact, Harmonize, Read the Bones, Dark Bargain, Ancient Craving, Ambition's Cost, Promise of Power, Scum to Temptation, and Sign in Blood. Yet another mouthful. Anyways. Let's also quickly go over some of our target removal cards with things like Return to Nature, Declaimer, Unravel the Aether, Beast Within, and Mortality Spear. One that I really want to highlight here is Mortality Spear, which is fantastic in this kind of a deck. It's an instant that costs 2 black-green, but we're pretty much never going to be paying that. It says this spell costs deals cast if you gain life this turn, destroy target non-land permanent. So for the most part, again, we're going to have plenty of opportunities to gain life in this deck, obviously. So yeah, this basically just costs 2 mana to destroy any target non-land permanent at instant speed. And when it comes to wraths, we even have some that can help us with life loss and life gain with things like Essence Pulse and Deadly Tempest. Essence Pulse says you gain 2 life, each creature gets -X until end turn where X the amount of life you gain this turn. So this is a board wipe that can be somewhat flexible. Again, we can basically gain some life to drain our opponents, maybe keep our commander on the board just at a base level, or if we really need to, we can gain more life with other sources and just take out pretty much everything. Speaking of taking out everything, we can destroy all creatures with Deadly Tempest, and it says each player loses life equal to the number of creatures they control that were destroyed this way. Again, we've got plenty of ways in this deck to pad our life total a ton, so making our opponents lose a lot of life based on their creatures can be really impactful with this. And of course, we can also utilize cards like Hex, Nevinyrral's Disc, and Gaze of Granite to clear the board. Hex is going to destroy 6 target creatures, Nevinyrral's Disc enters battlefield tapped, and we can pay 1 and tap to destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments, and Gaze of Granite is a bit more flexible. It's a sorcery for X, black, and a green. It says destroy each non-land permanent with mana value X or less. So depending on the situation that we're in, we can definitely play around with that X value. But we also have some ways to protect our things as well, with things like Tamiyo's Safekeeping, infused with Vitality, and Golgari Charm. Tamiyo's Safekeeping is an instant for just a green that says target you control gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, you gain 2 life. So on top of protecting one of our permanents, either from, target removal or from being destroyed, it also is going to gain us 2 life, which again is going to drain our opponents. Speaking of which, there's Infused with Vitality, which says until end of turn, target creature gains Death Touch, and when this creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under source control, you gain 2 life. So this can protect one of our key pieces, especially our commander, and on top of that, it's going to be gaining us some life to drain our opponents further. And then Golgari Charm is pretty flexible. It says all creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn, or destroy target enchantment, or regenerate each creature you control. So this can either take out a lot of small creatures, take out an enchantment, or protect our team. But now that we've gone through every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the price. As I mentioned before, every single card in this deck is less than $1, so it's very budget friendly with an estimated cost of $30.46. And actually keep in mind that that includes basic lands at 10 cents a piece, so if you've already got those, there's some extra savings there. And speaking of potential extra savings, if you buy this deck on TCG Player and utilize heavily played and damaged cards, you might save even more, and remember, those cards need a home too. Though do keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.